What kind? Makes it a little easier. All right. So our ancient lesson this morning comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you haven't heard these words in Scripture, you'll almost certainly have heard them in the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. This song was written by Pete Seeger and made famous by the Byrds. It remains emblematic of the social movement's 1960s. The lyrics to that song are almost verbatim from Scripture. Listen to the ancient words. For everything, there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw away stones and time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil.
Good morning, everybody. For those that don't know, I'm Morag Stewart, and my daughter thought Pastor Bob was very brave to give me a lectern and no time limit, and so let me begin kind of on a side. For those of you that got up to a foggy, damp morning, can you put your hand up? Okay, that would be the word dreich in Scotland, describes that kind of weather. I don't know if it's known in other languages, but this is a dreich day. However, I'm here today to talk to you about Scotland's poet, Robert Burns. I'm not a Burns scholar, but I'm the daughter of one. My father was one. I will share a few facts and attributes of Scotland's most renowned poet. But I'm going to begin by giving you just a little bit of information about the era in which Burns lived. The defeat of Highland Scots at Culloden by an English army was in April 1746. And the Highland clearings, that is cleaning out all the people, began in 1750. Burns was born in January 1759. That's why Burns suppers are in January, by the way. Although Burns was not a Highlander, I believe Burns would have been influenced by the cultural erasure and displacement or deportation taking place in Scotland. It basically was the end of the clan system. Burns died 21st of July, 1796. So that means he lived to be 37 and a half. This book of poems and songs of Robert Burns has over 1,100 entries. So I can confidently say he was a prolific writer. According to James Bark, who edited and compiled this Burns book, I have used his words in many cases in order to characterize Burns. He was extremely poor. He was a subsistent farmer, but he was educated in what were known as the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and he was well grounded in the theology of Presbyterianism. Scotland was very much a Reformed nation in the following Calvin tradition. In Blake's words, Burns was one of the supremely great artists. He listed him alongside Beethoven, Shakespeare, Rembrandt, and you can go on and on. Not only could he read and write, he could remember. He had a very good memory. He was surcharged with emotion, awareness, sensibility, and despite his poverty and ill health most of his life, he could laugh. He wasn't bitter about his circumstance. He relished the gift of life. Being a subsistence farmer and starting to help on the farm as a young child, he had a strained heart, and he was subject his whole life to bouts of rheumatic fever. Blake names him as the world's first poet. His works were known and translated into many languages, and if you think that's a bit stretching the truth, I'll deviate and tell you that I was a visiting professor in Russia for 3 months, January, February, March 1991. I was a visiting professor in the economics department, teaching in the computing area. All the students there knew Burns' works, and I was asked by the English department, would I please come in one day and read Burns' work in the Scottish dialect, because they learned it with Russian translation. So they set the time as a Saturday morning so the students didn't have classes, and I went into a standing room only auditorium, which kind of took me quite by surprise. Nobody in the States until today has ever asked me to speak about Burns. So Burns was a humanitarian, a libertarian, an equalitarian. His sympathies were for the poor, the oppressed, and the animal kingdom. He hated all manner of cruelty, oppression, and he also hated the arrogance of many privileged and those with wealth. He was a great musician, as great probably as he was a poet. I'm sure Vern and Janet know well the My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, which was his most famous, I think, best known song that Burns wrote. He's credited with rescuing from oblivion hundreds of Scottish songs, setting music to others, and often where there was fragmented words, he would fill them out. So he's credited with at least 300 as far as this book goes. He was a visionary. He wrote in one of his poems, For All That and All That, it is coming yet for all that man to man the world over shall brothers be for all that. He has some sentiments that are very reminiscent of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, on to what is the order of the day, cited on page 10 in this book as the world's national anthem, and that is the song he wrote, Auld Lang Syne. I will read it in the original Scottish dialect. Before I do that, let me tell you that this is not just sung at New Year's in Scotland, and by the way, in Scotland it's not called New Year's Eve, it's called Hogmanay. It is also sung at weddings, at gatherings. If any of you ever go to the Edinburgh Festival, they have the tattoo, and it always ends with Auld Lang Syne. So it's anytime there's a gathering and then a parting, that is when the song is sung. And the Scots can all sing it, even if it's pouring rain and dreich, they still will heartily sing Auld Lang Syne. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, should all acquaintance be forgot and days of Auld Lang Syne, and surely you'll be your pint stoop, and surely I'll be mine, and we'll tak a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne. We twa hae run about the braes, and put the good uns fine. But we'd wander mony a weary foot since Auld Lang Syne. We twa hae puddled in the burn, frae morning until dine, but seas between us braid hae roared sin Auld Lang Syne. And here's a hand, my trusty fear, and gaze a hand o' thine, and we'll tak a right good willy walk for Auld Lang Syne. It probably didn't make much sense to you, but that last verse in Scotland, that's when you hold hands, and you don't hold hands like this. You typically hold hands like this. And if you're in a gathering, like in an extended family or so on, you will also move. When you sing the last verse, you will move forward to your circles as tight as it can be, and then you'll go back out and kind of extend yourself. So that, remember that when you hear the Auld Lang Syne tonight, and I can tell you it's almost New Year's in Scotland. They're 8 hours ahead.
Thank you, Morag, for giving us a little bit more context on that. Sometimes we say an ancient lesson and then a modern lesson, but Auld Lang Syne barely would qualify as a modern lesson. It's still a very old lesson. So thank you for bringing it to life a little bit for us. Well, as hinted at, Auld Lang Syne has got to be one of the most widely sung and possibly least understood songs of all time for most of us. How many of you had actually read the words before today, if you're looking in your bulletin? Some of us have, many of you probably had not. How many of you knew that there were several verses of it? I think most of us only sort of know the chorus, right? Writer John Green has a fantastic reflection on Auld Lang Syne that featured on his podcast, The Anthropocene Reviewed. That's in many ways what started me thinking about Auld Lang Syne seriously. I'd of course heard it, but never really thought about it. He remarks how fascinating it is that we mark every new year with such an old song. It's probably, as Morag said, one of the most recognized songs in the world, but most people don't know the words. I know that for a long time, I had heard the words, "May old acquaintance be forgot." It wasn't until somewhat recently that I realized the opening line from Burns is actually quite the opposite. Burns begins with a rhetorical question: should we forget about old friends and never think about them again? The answer is, of course not. The song is about remembering the good old times. The title is derived from the Scots pronunciation of essentially old long since, which we could call back in the day, way back when, or the good old days, whatever suits you. But Burns remarked to a friend that he believed that this saying, which, like most sayings, doesn't exactly translate into English, was exceedingly beautiful. He wrote a letter to a friend, and on the back of it was what we believe is the first version of Auld Lang Syne ever written down. And this is what Burns said so poetically about that little phrase, Auld Lang Syne. He said it was incredibly beautiful and said, "Light be the turf upon the breast of the heaven-inspired poet who composed this glorious fragment." High praise. I have to agree, it's a rather beautiful phrase once you actually sit and listen to it. And if you just pause with it for a moment, it's a really powerful image. As we cross the threshold into the new year, you can imagine taking a long, wistful look back at what's come before, the last 364 days. I think that in the popular imagination, this song means something like, "Oh, that's over, let's get on with it." That makes a lot of sense. Humans are hopeful creatures. We look forward to the future with the belief that it's always going to be better than what's come before. Of course, climate change, disaster capitalism, and the ongoing threat of war certainly complicate that vision, but generally, most of us are glad to turn the calendar to January each year. There's this tremendous promise in the future. It holds possibilities that seem foreclosed in the past. Not to mention, as of yet, we can only ever move into the future. We can't stop, and we certainly can't go backward. But Auld Lang Syne, I believe, is an invitation to pause. It is a timeless song. It feels as relevant going into 2024 as it did when Burns took it down from an old man, as he said, more than 2 centuries ago. But I would argue that despite being timeless, in the sense that it seems to transcend any particular moment in time and exist eternally, it is also an incredibly timely song. It is a song that dwells in time and shows us how to dwell in time in a very particular way. It names the experience of the liminal. The liminal, or liminality, is the phenomenon of being between 2 states. It is the experience we have when we are no longer who we were before, but we are not yet who we are becoming. It is a space in which we can become disoriented, but it can also be a space of great clarity if we're willing to sit there. The image of a threshold or a hallway seems fitting. You can imagine yourself at a New Year's Eve party. When you're in the room with everyone, you're part of it. You are contributing to the dynamic and the conversation. You can only see so much of it because you're within it. But as you leave the room, maybe for another room, maybe to go home, if you pause in the doorway and take a look back into that room, you will see that room more clearly, more completely. Auld Lang Syne is like that. It pauses in the doorway. It's a moment out of time, and yet it is a particular way of reflecting on and inhabiting time itself. Our reading from Ecclesiastes this morning also deals with the passing of time, this sense that the past and the future has been placed within us by God. The author speaks with the same sort of timelessness that Burns captures, a timelessness that can only be achieved by someone who has mastered the art of living in time. For everything, there is a season. This season is rich, I believe. We've passed through the longest nights of the year. The days are ever so slowly growing longer. The new year is upon us. The Christ child has been born, an infant, a new year. It isn't all that hard to see the similarities. Both bring the possibility of fresh starts, chances for things to be different, and neither is completely free of the world before. When we wake up tomorrow, it will be 2024. And 2023's wars will still be raging on. A baby is always born into a family that has a history. That history will shape the child's life. Thinking about history and the future can make your head spin, but it's a lot easier in some ways than thinking about the present moment. Some of you practice meditation or prayer or some other form of awareness. We can focus on our breath to stay in the moment, or the sensations we feel in our bodies as a way of grounding ourselves in the present moment, but it takes practice. The mind has a way of running either ahead into the future or back into the past. But if we can find a way to stay here in this liminal moment for just a little while, we get a perspective that I believe is precious and rare. This whole week between Christmas and New Year's feels like a blob of time, doesn't it? A lot happens, nothing really happens. It goes by really quickly and it drags on and on. I think there's some genius to that. Jesus probably wasn't born on December 25th, as many people are quick to point out, but I actually think it is a perfect time to mark the birth of Christ. It takes this magical moment, the present, and it stretches it out for almost a week. As Christians, we will again tell the story of who this child is to become. We will celebrate, marvel, and grieve. We have a sense already of the life ahead of this child. The story has already been written and told over and over and over again, and yet there is this moment when we pause, hearing the call of this Christ, to dare to imagine the world otherwise. The future can only spring from the past, and yet there is this magical threshold moment, this liminal time called the present, in which we can choose what both will become. Christ, the incarnate love of God, invites us to live in the love of God, to show that love among us in the present moment, not to put it off till the future, not to imagine that it only existed in the past, but to live it in the present moment. And when we do that, we create a future that we should be hopeful for. And we live a past that we will one day look back upon with joy. Christ is the fulfillment of prophecies, the culmination of a story generations in the making, and Christ is the hope we have for our future. Christ is the eternally present moment of encounter. Christ is where who we are meets what we will become. And so, before we leave this manger, before we are swept into all that 2024 promises to be, just take a good long look at this child. Have we created a world that can welcome this child with loving tenderness? Sadly, we have not. And yet, this child, this threshold moment, this manger creates a place of encounter where what has passed does not have to dictate what is to come. This child changes everything if we let this child, this moment, change us. This week between Christmas and New Year's, this week when nothing happens, this week that feels like a hallway between the years, is a journey of its own. From what child is this to go tell it on the mountain? I pray that we would all continue that journey well into the new year. I pray that the hope of the new year, the hope of Christ, is living in you all right now, today. May it give you the peace to look back upon this journey with grace and tenderness, and may it draw you into a future that exceeds all your expectations. But may that hope and that peace always dwell within the present moment. These are the good old days of tomorrow, so make them glorious. Amen.